Great. We spoke quite a lot about regulation this morning. In a way, regulation, especially with cryptocurrency, is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Our next speaker is Adrian Dommisse from Dommisse Attorneys. Adrian's been very involved with e-money and with cryptocurrency for clients, so he's been operating very much in the real world, trying to navigate the regulatory environment for his fintech clients. So I'm sure he'll have some great insights. Adrian, thank you.
Thank you. Everyone hear me? Is this on? No. Lights on.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, now it's on. Wonderful. I usually start the legal panel by saying, this is the legal panel, please don't leave, because most people think it's the most boring one. Thank you very much. And it's certainly not going to be nearly as boring as the title. The title is based on, obviously, proposals and predictions, but it's really coming down to our experience with startup companies, South Africa. So our law firm is slightly unusual. We focus exclusively on startups. 6 years ago, myself and my partners left relatively big institutions, myself, big law firms and investment bank, came back to South Africa and started Dommisse Attorneys. And we really thought that the place to be, the most inspiring place to be, would be to work with founders of businesses. So we looked around Cape Town and there's all this stuff going on. So we put out our shingle and suddenly we started working with founders of businesses, and they were typically startup businesses, and more of them became obviously fintech businesses. So over the last few years, we've been interested in a number of kinds of fintech. We've worked for example, the guys that brought you SnapScan, 27, Yoko, a couple other guys that I've forgotten now. But more interesting for the present purposes are e-money type companies, or money payments type companies. And my favorite case study in this regard is a company called Zona. So Zona started in Zambia, and they were a proper startup. They cashed in their pension funds to pay my fees in the first month. Not really, actually, I really helped them along that line. But they did cash in their pension fund to pay salaries, and they worked really hard, and they carved out an amazing e-money business in Zambia, and now they're in their third territory, and we're evaluating the regulations across 3 other territories for their growth. They're raising money, they're doing really well. So it's a great case study. The essence of our experience there is really, what will the impact be of regulations on guys in your industry for their values? Because ultimately, as startup lawyers, our perspective is pretty unusual for law firms. It's helping to grow the value of our clients, because otherwise they won't exist and we won't have clients. So everything we do in terms of our services and our dialogue and our interface to clients is based on what we do to help your value. And that's really been the reason why we've managed to continue, survive, and grow. A facet of building value is recognized in the impact of regulation on your company. If you're a startup company, you typically don't have tons and tons of cash to respond to regulations, especially heavy regulations. In fact, it can be a threat to your business viability. So what we're going to do today is look at patterns that we've seen in the e-money world across Africa, South Africa, but more north of Africa, and managing those opportunities and risks. So predicting them, talking about how they might or might not apply to Bitcoin especially. So I'm not talking about blockchain. It's going to be a lot less technical in the last few presentations. This is the kind of pattern we've seen so far to date. And it's a great one. There's industry inception, there's growth. Growth normally or can result in certain events, bad ones, which results in regulation or over-regulation. And then we have a post-regulatory environment, which can be pretty hard to deal with for some of our clients based on their size and their ability to afford them. So let's talk about industry inception. This is the heyday of a startup. We saw that awesome curve just now, where everyone's rising this wave of enthusiasm, and now you're sitting in Zambia or Tanzania, wherever you are, and you're starting your business. And because you're a passionate founder, you're interfacing with the regulator often. The regulator knows your face, trusts you, you're in the circle of trusts, you're working very closely. Because you are intimately close to your business, the business is a naturally compliant business. So the compliance is not a really big issue when you have 15 employees. And it's an awesome business because you're really passionate about it, and often you're seeing customers themselves, and you probably are not regulated, or you have light regulation, and the regulator's okay with that. He knows you, might know your family, and therefore it sort of works okay. That sets the foundation. Naturally, as a founder, you've got aspirations for a $1 billion business, and you grow because you've got such a great product. But with growth brings size in your own company, and other participants. Now the problem is, and I think this is relevant to Bitcoin and maybe blockchain generally, but new participants come along. New participants that have not engaged the regulator, have not invested in the country. They may be less compliant. They may have short-term profit motives. And this is specifically what we see in the e-money world. And then, because the business got really big, your customers have given the same trust they created for you in the new participants, an event happens. Business failure, illicit transactions, just shocking customer service. And the regulator says, hang on, this is a threat to the smooth running of our country's economy. And light regulation is blamed. The regulator responds by imposing heavy-handed, far-reaching regulations. This has happened, obviously, in the past before. They respond with requirements of licensing, capitalization. Geez, who can come up with $500,000? System audits, another $500,000. Reporting requirements that take up, rooms full of people, more people than you've ever employed before. And then director responsibility, direct liability, responsible party liability, you name it. This is the bad scenario, and this is where we don't want to go. So this is kind of the discussion of what I'd like to lead and draw your comments out on. The post-regulatory environment, no prize for guessing there. Intense regulation is a threat to the viability of my clients, and the threats due to cost compliance. The implications of non-compliance personally for the directors, that can be a jailable offense. And the fact that, frankly, you had a great industry with all sorts of potential and opportunity, and now it's frankly it's not attractive to players in the startup early stage world. Banks, different, lots of cash, they can maybe invest in it if they see value. So, how do we avoid that heavy-handed regulation? Well, let's look first at what e-money does and what it doesn't do, and why it's different to Bitcoin in particular. So it's a closed-loop system, which means that you go along, you pay cash to, for example, Zona or Peza, and you get a credit, an e-money credit. And you can then use that to transact on that platform, on the Zona platform, for example, or Peza platform, Airtel platform, whatever. But the money has very little value outside of that platform. So the customer stands to lose out with the counterparty is unwilling or unable. You have counterparty risk, classic counterparty risk. It's a closed-loop system. If there's fraud or business failure, you're unlikely to get your money back. They do have capitalization rules. So, some cash gets in a bank account somewhere. But after liquidation, is it going to be there? I'm not really sure. This is the primary issue that's been regulated in the e-money world. Essentially, the quality, the trustworthiness, the character, the systemic abilities of the counterparty we're talking about here. So that's a very important distinction. Let's look at Bitcoin and see what Bitcoin would present in terms of risks. These are going to be quite layer risks, right? So you've had massively technical, very impressive presentations. There are presentations coming after me that will deal with intensive regulatory considerations. So I kind of look at what the regulator would probably see if those layers meet on Bitcoin. So background, cryptocurrency, it's not a closed-loop system, right? So you can't only spend it on Airtel's system. And I would say it has a value, an independent value. The Bitcoin, the blockchain title that you have to Bitcoin has value that can be traded for assets outside of any counterparty's exchange, for example. So, in that context, systemic risk. Naturally, it's a decentralized system. You naturally have risk of the whole system falling over. That's a much bigger question which I'm going to leave to you guys to consider. But the market value risk is probably more typical of the layperson buying Bitcoin. In other words, the exchange rate today, $413 so dollars. A year ago, it was very different. A year before that, also very different. But this isn't the kind of risk that you regulate, right? This is speculation. This is the kind of risk that basically you expect people to jump into, unless you're going to look for qualified regulator investments or require maximum minimum investments for different kind of people. The perceived anonymity is probably the kind of risk that a regulator is going to latch onto. In other words, Bitcoin being used for transactions which are frankly just outright dodgy. Classic one is the virus that comes and takes over your computer. And the message comes up, if you ever want to see your hard drive again alive, give me $500 in Bitcoin. So it's a common one. That's an example. There are much more dodgy ones around there. Question is, are regulations required? Are intense regulations required in order to address this anonymity? Well, speaking to participants in the market, it's actually not completely anonymous. There's a perception of anonymous. And there is somebody in the whole in the whole world of Bitcoin or in the chain of Bitcoin that can find out identities, that knows identities. So this really is a question, is it possible to develop a reasonable and minimal regulatory framework that can address that concern before heavy-handed regulation comes in when that event comes up, that terrible event which causes risk to the economy? So before we ask ourselves how far should regulation go, obviously we should look at what is the value of Bitcoin to Africa. And this again is another example where e-money experience, I think, is illustrative and also gives balance to the scales. You're a very educated and experienced crowd. Outside of this room, mentioned Bitcoin. Obviously, it's going to be, oh, you know, it's been used by Silk Road and been used by these dodgy. Let's look at the reality in terms of what is the opportunity. And I think this is the kind of dialogue a lot of people have been having with regulators, which makes it exciting to them. I think the three-stage discussion we had earlier might. Bitcoin, blockchain, Bitcoin. So risk-benefit. Well, firstly, e-money has transformed certain African countries. Bear in mind, Africa is a continent. Depending on your country, 50 to 80% of your population are unbanked. A credit card, they don't even have a bank account. They don't even want a bank account. Because I went to an African country which shall not be named, driving along, and I was with some clients of mine, all packed out laughing. So what are you laughing about? And they pointed up to a billboard, so-and-so bank celebrating its 14th branch in 30 years. 14 branches for a country 2/3 size of South Africa. My client had 600 agents that can transact, from spaza shops to guys at the local equivalent of the ShopRite to franchises. That's the power that e-money has. So what it's doing is it's creating an incredibly efficient local environment. You can walk to the shop, transfer cash to your granny 1,000 kilometers away. You know what you had to do last week? Put money into an envelope, give it to the taxi driver, and ask him to deliver it 1,000 kilometers away. So that's the unbanked world. That's kind of what we're facing here. So let's take this one step further into the cryptocurrency world. What does that provide us with? Well, obviously, theoretically, it provides us with the opportunity to open up international trade. It's not a closed-loop system, it's an open-loop system. And what is the value of international trade or empowering people for international trade in the Bitcoin world? So that alone is staggering. Think about how it converts local economies, just local transactions. It can provide amazing value. If you think about most of the challenges we see to African international trade for the entrepreneur in the street, it's not the fact that his currency is regulated, like in South Africa. That's not the issue. It's the practicalities. How the hell do I get local currency, let alone international currency, into a bank account, transferring it? Just how am I going to get there? So what we're talking about here really is enhancing regulated, efficient markets as opposed to regulated, inefficient markets. And that's really the exciting opportunity. So now that we know what the potential is, what the glam, shining hope is, what is the source of risk? Well, it's not going to be that pioneer I told you about in the beginning, the guy that's the first participant in the market, the guy that's got the first name-based relationship with the regulator, the guy that's invested in local assets, the guy that can be arrested if he breaches local regulations, or his assets can be seized and forfeited. The risk is probably going to be from the participants offshore, short-term profit-driven. They feel immune from local regulations. If you create regulations to deal with them, your regulations are firstly powerless because they're not going to care, and secondly, you're going to kill the local market. Well, you're going to make it much more expensive to deal with. So, at this point, a friend of mine likes me to compare to the gun control licensing. It's a bit emphatic, I know. Gun control debate. 100% of guns licensed to people in this country are legal and regulated. I'd say 100% of the guns used in crime in this country are not legal or regulated because the people using them don't have licenses. So what's the point of regulating, of slapping on hectic regulations for the legal guns? I know it's a bit simplistic, but it's an interesting analogy for us to consider anyway. Okay, so the need of a new paradigm. There are paradigms being created. The US has developed and is deploying a very interesting one. We've got very cool ideas following presentations later on, which we're going to talk about those. But like Bitcoin, you can't use the history entirely. You can use history to develop patterns, which I'm going to talk about in my conclusion, to anticipate patterns and to anticipate the responses to the likely events. But like Bitcoin, the framework is probably going to be innovative in itself. E-money is a useful tool. that can't form basis. So, in closing, the fastest presentation by far, I see. While the regulation of Bitcoin is obviously going to have to be quite innovative, the approach you should take of it is manifestly conventional. In other words, starting point, define the value. Define the value, what is this thing we need to regulate, and what is the value to my country, the country in particular. Bearing in mind all the considerations like international trade, obstacles to it, availability of foreign currency, penetration of banking. Then develop that logical, coherent regulation based on the real risks posed by genuine participants who are engaging with it. Try, if at all possible, to avoid those heavy-handed knee-jerk reactions to the terrible transactions that you might see, but from people outside of that circle of trust, so to speak. And then ultimately, if we can, and if it's value, empower the value that cryptocurrencies bring to economies. That's all from my side. Are there any questions?
Great, thank you very much. Adrian?
Thanks, that was great. Just a question from me, and I know you skimmed over it there for good intention. The systemic risk side, how does a regulator even start that discussion? Because I think that's obviously you get compensated to reduce systemic risk.
Yes.
And put things in place.
Yeah.
How does a regulator even start that discussion?
You know, what I would say is first and foremost is education. You know, you distill the brains and knowledge in this room, and you explain to them what exactly it is. In that last presentation, that all the presentations I had so far, I've explained what exactly it means to have a blockchain. What would the event need to be to create systemic failure? To regulate that, no one's really going to care what Tanzania or Zambia does, right? They're not going to affect it. So it's going to have to be, unfortunately, an education process and trial and error, and hopefully having local participants play a responsible role as possible. I don't know how much further you can go. It's like trying to regulate the tide. Hi.
Thank you for the talk. In the South African context, the regulators, are they leaning towards currency or commodity? And then what do you foresee with taxation on that?
So the regulators themselves, I know, are extremely open to dialogue. I haven't been a participant to those discussions myself, but they've released a really interesting white paper and discussion around it, and they've been extremely supportive. I understand also some of the people we work with have actually even had dialogue with enforcement agencies, South African enforcement agencies. So I think that they are, I don't think they've got a position yet. Some people can jump out of the audience their personal experience around that. In terms of taxation, it's always going to be based on the good old principle which applies to Bitcoin or squirreling your IP offshore. Resident-based tax is really what it's going to be about. Where are you based? Where's your residence? Where do you pay tax? And that's where you'll be taxed in South Africa. And I really wouldn't try and get around that one.
Hi, Adrian. I just wanted to ask about exchange control.
Yes.
And currently, what is placed on buying Bitcoin from an exchange control perspective, and is it being regulated, and values, numbers?
Not yet. It's the elephant in the room, obviously. But the same rules would apply. You have R1 million allowance to do whatever you want every year. 10 million allowance if you get your tax clearance. Over and above that, I understand it's essentially it's a clearing system in order to acquire foreign exchange. And by doing that, you have to comply with the usual forex regulations. If you're just buying Bitcoin and holding it, I don't think that's really conceived yet in terms of as a part of the forex. Of course, buying and holding it is a totally different transaction.
So you're saying buy the Bitcoin, hold it, but then when you want to exchange it for some piece of property or
you'd probably be
or
safe
commodity.
if you do that because it's not a currency, not regarded as a currency yet. But the risks of holding Bitcoin are quite extensive. So most people are really using it as a conduit for a transaction. Thanks. Hi.
Hi. Following on his question, are agencies, are international agencies talking to each other about regulation, or is it centralized to South Africa, Nigeria, various countries?
What do you mean by agencies? Regulators.
Governmental agencies or regulators.
No, in e-money, definitely. e-money, they're almost certainly using each other's protocols, experiences, and they do have dialogue. We, for example, went to the Malawian regulator, and we had a letter of introduction from the Zambian regulator, and that was extremely well received. And Bitcoin, I don't know, I'd be surprised they are, but in certain African contexts.
You mentioned now, sorry, I'm over here. You mentioned now that Bitcoin is not considered a currency, so there's no exchange control reporting requirements around it yet. Can you say then why does it not attract VAT if it's from a regulatory perspective? If it's not a currency, but it's effectively a commodity or something that you're purchasing, why do we not pay VAT on Bitcoin?
I'm not sure. Anyone else have experience in that? Zero rated.
It's like bread.
I'm not sure the transaction itself is so close to currency. I think of it as currency. I'm not sure how they treat it.
Sorry, you either have exchange control or VAT.
Correct. So what you're asking me is, has SOB yet decided that this is a currency?
Yeah.
I think they have.
Do you see in the whole blockchain cryptocurrency environment that the industry will move towards self-regulation, or do you think that they'll stand back and look to governments to regulate? What is your opinion? I know it's shot in the blue, but what is your opinion? I'm
going to answer that, but I really would love some opinions on this one. Self-regulation would be perfect. I see it as too significant, too fundamental for economies generally, structural issues in economies, for it to be self-regulated for forever. Any views on that? Self-regulation versus regulation. Is that?
Hello, yeah. So I work for a Bitcoin company, Kraken, who has a very large presence in Japan. And in Japan, what happened was we created a self-regulatory body known as JADA. And pretty much now, which is actually happening right now, almost to the letter, they're now looking to codify that into legislation. And it was extremely effective, extremely. So the industry came together after Gox, wrote a series of common sense rules surrounding addressing the main concerns from the Japanese perspective, from the government's perspective, and now they're looking to write that into law. So, I don't know about the situation here at all, almost whatsoever, but it was a very successful experiment.
That's almost a test case for many self-regulated bodies. As a profession, we're self-regulated, but they're only allowed to be self-regulated because we are very, very regulated. And actually those regulators have the power of law through the Attorneys Act or something along those lines. So if you can achieve that, I mean, that's ideal. What you're saying is you're going to the regulator, you're saying, okay, these are the risks, this is the educational process we're going through, this is the way we're going to regulate our participants, and they look at it and they say, well, firstly, you're doing a better job than we can do because you understand it better and you're being honest, and we're going to give the power of law to your regulations in time. That would be fabulous evolution.
It also obviously has a lot to do with the perspective and priorities and maybe the intelligence of the regulatory bodies, because I think one of the perspectives from the Japanese regulators was that we can try to, like, quote unquote, nip this in the bud now, but then we can be sure that Tokyo doesn't become the Silicon Valley of Bitcoin, right? And so I guess it's a giant experiment in regulatory game theory from all the jurisdictions on Earth, and Japan played the right move, I think.
It's a very interesting perspective there. Thank you.
Great. Any more questions? One more in the front. Thanks.
So a bit more controversial. Why is e-money such a big issue? If you really think about it, let's use the South African terms. We've actually not had any currency, really, for the last couple of decades. Our currency is not really backed by any like it was gold. Most of our transactions is currency-less. Why is it such a big issue for the regulators?
So e-money outside of South Africa is unique because of the extent of the penetration of banks. Everyone has a bank account, and most people you meet have bank accounts. e-money is relevant purely for the empowering nature it has on general customers. From your perspective, specifically with South Africa, that goes a bit beyond my pay grade, I'm afraid. I'll be honest.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you. Great. And please feel free to engage with Adrian over lunch. He won't be charging lawyer fees. He said still free consulting at lunchtime.